Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Spencer Vann with me. Spencer is the CEO of Surplus Funds. And additionally, I think as you hear his story today, something that really stuck out to me is with a big enough why, how doesn't matter. And he's been able to really figure that out as he continues to grow his business. So, Spencer, thanks so much for being on today, man.
It's an honor. It's a pleasure to be here, Phil. And yeah, I'm excited to share as much as I can with your audience.
You bet. So, growing up inside the family dynamic, you have a brother that is diagnosed with autism. So, talk a little bit about just growing up in a household with a special needs brother and some of the uh, complications that can come with that.
Yeah, it's funny because I'll say the biggest thing that happened when I was a kid with my brother being autistic is I didn't realize that not everybody goes through that
Mhm.
until I was much older. And so my whole life, like I was taking care of my younger brother. He would have these crazy temper tantrums. Like when he got older, he'd be punching holes in the wall, and he couldn't speak, and just all the severe symptoms of autism.
Yeah.
And I just learned to deal with those things at a young age, to kind of deal with that chaos. That I guess I didn't realize until I was like 14, 15 years old. That like, oh, this is not normal.
Mm.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the biggest impact it probably had on me was, it gave me something to say, like, this chaos is going on in my household with my brother being autistic and just craziness. Like, it made me want to be out of the house. And so it
Mm.
gave me a lot of fuel to be passionate about other things. And when I was really young, it was martial arts, and then became basketball, then it became business. So
Yeah. So passionate about basketball, you did become. So talk a little bit about getting introduced to the game of basketball, and what about it captivated you and made you really want to focus on that sport?
yeah, it's funny because I pretty much played every sport first before I played basketball. And my mom always makes jokes with me. She's like, whatever I would tell Spencer to do, he would just do the opposite. So when I was a little kid, she was like, oh, you should play basketball. And I was like, no, I don't play basketball. And I was always tall for my age, so that was why. And then I remember I was like in fifth grade, and she was like, hey, look, why don't you just try it for a year or whatever? So I'm like, okay. Tried it for a year, was really bad at it, of course, my first year, but I loved it.
Mm.
And I was running up and down the court, just having a great time. And one of the biggest things I loved about it that I soon discovered was, when you play baseball, when you play football, when you play these other really popular sports, you can't just go down to the football field and just play football.
Yeah.
Like, you can't. You got to get a group of people, and then you got to make teams. And like basketball, I can just go down to any basketball court, and even if no one's there, I can just shoot around and have a great time. Right?
Yeah.
Like, for even to this day, like for 3 hours, I can just have a great time. But especially when I was a kid and I have all this energy, and it's like I want to get out of the house, and so I just developed a passion for that, and it just became my daily routine. And the next thing you know, within a few years, it's like I'm playing every day. I'm traveling across the country playing basketball, and it's this whole thing that your whole identity becomes basketball, right?
Yeah. So we're going to get to the identity piece, but before that, someone listening right now hears you say, all right, you weren't very good, but you loved it. And eventually you became really good at it. And I think for a lot of folks, we fear trying something
Mhm.
because we're not good at it. And well, if I never try it, I probably won't become good at it. But you can actually fall in love with things that you aren't originally good at. So talk about that, once again, it could be from a basketball perspective or just a life perspective, right? Hey, you know what? Sometimes it's worth trying something to see if
Yeah.
you'll love it.
It's actually really funny. There's this quote from a book I've been reading recently. The book's called Leadership Thinking, Being, Doing. And it talks about what people like versus don't like. And one of
Mm.
the quotes, I'm going to paraphrase it here, but basically people like what they're competent at. So people like what they're
Mm.
good at. But
Yeah.
how do you become good at anything without liking it?
Yeah.
Right. And it's this weird dynamic of those two things. And I mean, for me, it was, I fell in love with it for the benefits it had outside of the sport. Like, I didn't fall in
Yeah.
love with it being like, oh, I'm going to like get great at basketball just for the sake of getting great at basketball. I fell in love with it because like, it was fun, right? It was, getting me outside of the house, getting me to go out in the sun and have a good time. Um, and just the culture of basketball. I fell in love with the culture of going down and talking smack and, playing defense. Like, I loved it.
Yep.
But I would say that the biggest thing that I've learned in regards to that has just been, ultimately, and Patrick Bet David said this really well. what happens in life is you enter a room, and if you're an ambitious person, eventually you find yourself towards the top of the room of, say 100 people, right? You end up with the top of that room. And then you have a choice to make. And that choice is, do I enter the next room where I start all the way back from zero and I'm the bottom guy in the room and work my way all the way back up? Or do I stay in that first room and be, the top of this room without actually, growing at all? And for me, my natural inclination has always been just enter the next room right away. Don't even think about it. And I don't really know why that is, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, so let's dive into that a little bit. I think for a lot of people, there's a sense of comfort knowing that I've reached a pinnacle of a certain level, right? And there's an extreme sense of discomfort when I lose the comfort of knowing I'm at the top of one level and I'm now going to be at the bottom of another. So, for you, would you say it's that ability to get rid of your ego to say, hey, I'm ready to step in? Would you say it's I just love to learn from others, or I'm, ambitious to grow? What about you allows you to step into that next room?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of my core life principles I live by is dominate over compete. And the way I look at that is like, I've never believed in competing. And when I'm saying competing, I mean just externally, right? Like I want to be the best in the world at whatever I do, but I also want to be the best that I can be. And I want to dominate that. Like I want to settle for slightly above average or average. And so for me, I think what happens in my brain is like, I'll enter a room, and by the time I get to the top of that food chain, I just already feel like this is, I don't want to say like beneath me, but like that I'm capable of more. And I'm just not willing to accept not at least trying, and not, pushing myself to enter that next room and grow and see what I can do. Because I think really, life becomes really boring if you just say, hey, I'm happy with where I'm at. I don't know how old you are. I'm a pretty young guy. I'm sure your audience is all different ages, but pretty much everyone on here, hopefully pray, right, that you have many, many more years to live. And if you just said, oh, I'm just going to stop growing and be at this level for the rest of my life, that'd be pretty boring. So.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. A friend of mine says you can have comfort or you can have growth, but it's really hard to have both. So I always remember that. Now, earlier you mentioned, so I get better at basketball and it really starts to become part of my identity. And then all of a sudden we have an ankle. So talk a little bit about getting good, we're getting better, injury.
Yeah. So I, in middle school was on this club team, started traveling around. And then by the time I got to high school, I got recruited to this particular high school to play at, and was, pretty good player. But really that was when I was like, I love basketball. I'm going all in on basketball. And I wake up every morning at like 5 a.m., get to school an hour early, work out for an hour, take a shower at school, go to the classes. I'd be playing basketball like 5-6 hours a day, after school, before school, this. And it was just, I was like, I want to go to the NBA. This is what I want to do. And then my sophomore year of high school, I'm playing at the park, and I go and I dunk on someone. And then when I land with my foot sideways on their foot, and I broke my ankle in like 6 places. Dislocated it. The bone came out of like the skin. Like it was pretty bad. And the best way I can explain it is basically my foot and my leg were in 2 different area codes, basically. Along with kind of shattering the ankle, I shattered my identity, because my whole identity was built on basketball, like being an athlete, being a basketball player, being a good basketball player. And that was it. Like that was all I had. And then on top of that, like, again, I alluded to earlier with the autism thing, like now I'm stuck at home in this chaotic environment that I was using basketball to escape from. So not only was I facing the fact that I lost my identity, but now I'm in this place where it's like, I'm just surrounded in chaos. And I think like going through that really taught me a lot. It taught me, I think most importantly, that like one of the lessons I learned, I hate to say this, but it's like, people change depending on how you're doing in life. And so at that time when I was playing basketball, before I hurt myself, I was winning. Everybody wanted to be my friend. I had all these friends, all these people that wanted to hang out with me. And then I break my ankle and it was like crickets. And I really took note of like, who are the people that are here now? Because these are the people that really love and care for me. And so that was a lesson. But I think the other lesson too is, as much as entrepreneurs do this all the time, but very highly driven people, like we can sometimes build our identity into the things we do. And there's nothing wrong with building the identity into the fact that you're a hard worker or that you're an entrepreneur or that you do these things. But to build an identity specifically in one particular thing, you know, you don't necessarily have control. You don't know when that might end, you know? And when that was taken away from me, it was like I was put in this crisis of like, well, who am I?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really important. And once again, we're talking about in the scope of basketball, but I mean, that could be a relationship, that could be a business, that could be a friendship, right? I mean, anything that we put our identity in that we truly don't control everything about it, it can be a dangerous spot, right? Because business can go out of business, business partnerships can separate, you know, relationships can end. And so that does leave you wondering, well, who am I now?
Absolutely. And what happens inevitably is, you know, human beings as we are, we need something, we need a self-identity to associate with, and we need a group. Like that's the whole thing of like, oh, I'm a basketball player. Well, now I'm a part of this culture of basketball players, right? And so when I lost that, I lost my tribe, I lost my group. And I'm sitting at home in this chaotic environment, and I'm you know, depressed. And I started to kind of really take note of, why did I love basketball? And why did I want to be in the NBA? Like, why is it really for basketball? And the answer I actually came to was like, well, kind of like, I do love the sport, but also like, I want to win. Like I want to win at life. And that was the path initially I'd found, was basketball. But ultimately, like, I didn't care the path. I just wanted to win.
Yeah. Well, in this time frame, your mom makes a comment to you about real estate, and that kind of gets your gears turning. So talk a little bit about that interaction, and then where you go next to start learning.
Yeah. So again, a broken ankle, I'm laying in bed, and literally I couldn't walk for like almost a month. And then after that, I couldn't play basketball for like almost a year. Right. So I'm just out of it. Right. And, you know, my mom, she's coming to keep me company and trying to talk to me. And growing up, we would always rent. We'd always rent where we lived. And she came to me one time and she was like, hey, you know, kind of opened up that her dream was to buy a home. And I was like, Mom, like, let's buy a home together. Like, I'll help you do it. And she was like, oh, it's never going to happen. And she got like all negative, like ran away. Right? And I was like, that was kind of weird, right? Like, obviously a touchy subject, right?
Yeah.
So, and then this happened a couple more times. And I don't know, after like the third time, I'm a little slow. It takes me a little, you know, a couple times sometimes. It hit me. And I was like, dude, if I get into real estate, like, I can potentially make some money to help her buy a house. Or at the bare minimum, connect her with someone that can, you know, help her get a deal or something, right? Like something productive can happen. And at this point, again, I'm searching for an identity. So I'm like, okay, let me just learn about real estate. At least I'll have something to do, right? So I start reading these real estate books. First book I ever read was Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad. And, you know, just all the basic fundamentals. I'm just starting to read. I'm watching YouTube videos. I'm just trying to take in as much information to learn about this stuff that, like, you know, I don't know. Cause like my predisposition when I'm 15, 16 years old, getting into real estate, is like, oh, you know, you have to have money. You have to have this, you have to have that. Well, I don't have any of that. Yeah. So I just dove in and started learning, and eventually ended up, when I got healthy, at a real estate meetup, you know, local, and I grew up in Orange County, California, local in Irvine, and hosted out of this hotel. And I show up there, and you know, I'm like probably 17 at this point. And the average age in that room is like 45, 50 years old. And I'm 17 and I'm shy. I'm very much an introvert naturally. And so I get in there and I'm like sitting in the corner, like hoping no one talks to me. Like, I don't even want to make eye contact with you. I just came here to listen to the speakers and I'm out. Right.
Yeah.
And I sat there for an hour. I didn't talk to anyone. And, you know, anyone that's been in that position before, that is more of a natural introvert and all that, what happens is you sit there and you start getting mad at yourself. Like, you're like, oh, I need to talk to people. I need, like, I look so stupid. Like, you start saying these things in your head. So I kept saying that to myself. And finally, like, you know, this is before the meeting even started. The host of the meeting was like, hey, our guest speaker, Jack Fullerton, is going to be here in 10 minutes to start speaking. If you need to go use the restroom now, whatever, you can go. I was like, okay. I was like, this is my opportunity to get up, go use the restroom, you know, bump into somebody, say hello, and then run away. Okay. And that's what I did. I went to the restroom, I'm washing my hands, and this elderly gentleman comes up to me, and he's wearing Crocs and cargo shorts. And he comes up to me, and he's washing his hands in the sink next to me. And I'm just like, I got to say something. So I, you know, hey, what's up? You know, how you doing?
Yeah.
And so we start, you know, kind of chatting, and he asked me, oh, you know, are you here for the real estate? And I say, yeah, you know, I am. He said, that's cool. He said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I don't really do anything, man. I'm a senior in high school. You know, I just came here to learn. He said, oh, really? He said, dude, that's awesome. So I started learning about real estate when I was in high school too. You know, what do you want to do? We're talking about my goals and all that stuff. And he says, well, look, he says, after the event, come talk to me. He says, nice to meet you. My name is Jack Fullerton. And then he went up and he was the guest speaker. So he went up and he spoke and just killed it. And he became like my first mentor. And yeah, so I mean, it's crazy what putting yourself into an environment that you're not comfortable in, like you talked about being comfort and growing, like can do, you know?
Yes. So within that, you start learning about different types of real estate. Because to your point, there is types of real estate that require significant capital. There are other types of real estate that, if you know how to do it, and maybe if you're open to maybe not necessarily more risk, but just different types of risk, then you have opportunities that can open up. So I think your first deal is either at 17 or 18 years old, and it's on the wholesale side. So talk about how that came to be.
Yeah. So you're talking about getting uncomfortable. Okay. So, yeah, so I started with bird dogging. And it's kind of funny because I always say I started with like the two hardest, like, I don't know, you know, in my head, like the hardest niches you can start with. So I first started with door knocking on foreclosures, which when you've no door knocking experience, no sales experience, and you're 17 years old, not an easy situation to do. In fact, I remember the first door I ever knocked on, I'd gotten a list of pre foreclosures, and I'm like sitting in my car, like I see the house, I'm sitting in my car for like literally almost an hour, like I just couldn't do it, right? And I have like a notebook, and I just started writing, like I wrote like 1,000 times, like I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, like 1,000 times, and I finally did it. And you know, that obviously didn't turn into like a deal like that, but it was just like overcoming that was just like incredible. And I remember leaving like, oh, like that actually wasn't like that bad. Like they're actually really nice about it, and it was fine. So I started with that, and then eventually, and I never got to deal with that, but eventually I moved on to cold calling probates. And if you're not familiar with probate, it's this court process that you go through basically if you know a loved one, you know, leaves assets that are not directly sent in. There's no will or something like that, right?
Yep.
And so I was calling people that, you know, they just had like their dad just passed away, and they're like inheriting this house that they probably can't afford. And I'm calling them saying, hey, I know your dad just died, but I want to buy that house. Okay. So
Yeah.
again, the two hardest niches possible, but I got some success with that. I started getting some deals. I got my first couple ones when I was 17, and then eventually 18, started kind of, you know, even doing better with it. And got to the point where I was making it, you know, 18, like, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10 grand a month, which again, when you're in high school, and even, you know, 17, making 4 or 5 grand a month, like when you're in high school and, you know, right out of high school, making 10 grand a month, like you're like the richest person on the face of the planet.
No doubt.
So
now with that, you know, once again, didn't have success right away. And I think too frequently someone starts a business or they hear the success story, right? And they're like, oh, well, when I start, I will just be where that person is, right? I mean, being in podcasting, I hear that all the time, right? Like I'm starting a podcast, and then I'll ask them 3 weeks later, how's the podcast going? They're like, oh, well, you know, it wasn't going very well, so I just quit. I was like, you did it for 3 weeks. Like, how well could you possibly thought this was going to go, right? Like Joe Rogan didn't do it for 2 weeks and then have, you know, millions and millions of listeners. But so what about you, you know, kept pushing through even when you weren't having success on the first type, right? And then you're like, well, opposed to just giving up on this altogether, I'm actually going to switch to a second type, and I'm going to have to learn a whole new way of going about it. So what about you, you know, kind of kept going there? Why keep going?
that's a really interesting question, because I think as I've gotten older, my reasoning for having perseverance has changed. But when I was younger, it was literally a state of like, I have to. You know, and whether or not logically I actually had to or not is different, but at least in my head I had to.
Convince yourself, yeah.
And you know, obviously with my brother being autistic and then me having this identity, it was like I felt like I had to, you know, make something of myself to help my parents and pay them back for all the stuff that they did with my brother Mason, and just everything that they did for me with my injury and all that. And so it was just a state of like of necessity, basically. And then as I've gotten older, I think it's changed, because, you know, now I'm in a place financially like I don't have to, right? Like now, if I don't know if I could retire and live the rest of my life now, I'm fairly young, but like I could definitely be okay, right? But now it's changed from like I have to like talking about identity, like I am, like that's just what I do, you know? So it's interesting actually thinking about that. I've never consciously thought about that. So
Well, keep pondering, you know, we'll follow up. No, so with that, in the real estate meetups, eventually you get introduced, or I guess you kind of search this out, but you meet David. And David ends up being a important part to your story. So talk a little bit about reaching out and that interaction and what comes from it.
Yeah. So this story is so funny. So, I'm going to these real estate meetups and I'm trying to learn, trying to get around people
Yeah.
that are successful. And obviously you just want to be around people that are more successful than you. And when you have nothing, everyone's more successful than you. So it wasn't very hard. And I was on meetup.com looking at these different real estate meetups, and I see this one pop up local, and I hadn't seen it before. And I said, oh, this is interesting. I said, let me read about it. I'm reading about it. It's like, this looks awesome. I want to go to this. And at the very bottom of the description, it says, you are not allowed to attend unless you can provide value. And I was like, well, crap, like I can't provide value. What the hell do I know?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know anything. So the guy that hosted this meeting or owned this meeting was a guy by the name of David Church. And I said, let me shoot him an email and ask permission if I can come. I don't want to come and say I'm not supposed to be here. So shot him an email, and like literally the email I still have it. It's like, hey, or dear Mr. Church, I am a 17-year-old high school kid. I noticed your meetup group online. I would love if I could have your permission to attend, something like that, right? And to my amazement, he got back to me. He was like, yeah, come on down. So I said, sure. So I went down there, and it was like this little rinky-dink meetup in literally like an extra room of like a pizza parlor. Like, I'm not even kidding you. It was like the smallest real estate meetup I've ever seen. And the gentleman that spoke that day, the guest speaker, he was talking about like trust or something, something like really advanced. And I was just sitting there like, I don't know what the hell this guy's talking about. Like, what is going on? But long story short, I met David. We met in person, and he was he was actually a high school teacher, and specifically a math teacher at a different high school that I went to, obviously. But he was just kind of like, dude, it's so cool that you're so young and here. Like, how can I help you? He wanted to serve. He wanted to help.
Yeah.
And I said, well, dude, I don't really know. I said, but how can I help you? And he was like, well, he was a fix and flipper, and he did some other real estate stuff, but he was a fix and flipper. And he said, well, I need some help with construction. Do you want to come help on construction? So sure enough, I found myself on the weekends, going over to his fix and flip sites and like ripping out kitchens and flooring and all different types of stuff. And eventually, he taught me kind of what he knew about, wholesaling and bird dogging and some other niches, fix and flipping and all these different things. He kind of took me under his wing, and
yeah,
we became pretty good friends at that point. So
yeah. Well, so I want to highlight what you said there, and that was you must be able to provide value. And I think that, especially in a business setting, oftentimes we think, well, what knowledge am I bringing, or what financial resource can I bring?
mm-hmm.
And the reality is, and on the young side, I think oftentimes the value you bring is people can see themselves in you, and they say, gosh, I wish I would have been your age and getting started in this, or I remember when I was your age. And so the value you bring is almost like this motivation to them, right? Or this, like reminiscent feeling of being in those shoes before. And so sometimes the value that we can provide isn't necessarily being the smartest, right? You weren't coming in there and telling Mr. Trust guy, hey, you don't know anything about trust. Let me tell you. You weren't coming in there with the checkbook, like, hey, who's got a real estate deal for me to just, sign a check and we'll go buy this and do it together. But the value you were bringing was an excitement to somebody else because of your age and your hunger for something.
Yeah. Well, and beyond that too, I think the other side of it is, when you are learning something, right? That when you first start learning something, the best way to learn it is to spend time reading and learning and being around people. But eventually you get good enough at something where the best way to continue learning is to actually teach it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to teach it, you need to have someone to teach it to. You can't just teach it to yourself. That doesn't make any sense, right? And I think that's the other side of it too, is like, there's this natural inclination that I think most people have, especially successful people, where they want to teach people things. Like they want to be a mentor to people and help people. And it just takes the right person to step up and ask, So I would say, above what you even said, I think that's also true. And just knowing that, hey, like people get value by just teaching.
Yep. You betcha. Love it. Now, through the course of this, and it might have been when you're doing some of the probate calling, I don't know when it comes in, but you start hearing about this idea of kind of surplus funds, and that's where your business today, really stemmed from. So one, educate the group what the heck that is, but then two, talk a little bit about getting into that and creating a business out of it.
Yeah. So at this point in time, that's what I was doing, the probate calls, and I was having some success. And I over the years of studying real estate at this point, I had taken this notebook where I had filled it out from front to back, every single real estate investing strategy I could find on the internet, like every single one. And I thought I was a genius. I was like, dude, I now know, this is years after the trust thing, right? I now know everything there's to know about real estate. I was very prideful. And then I went into this real estate meetup at one of David's clubs, or one of David's meetups. And he had this guest speaker come in, and this guy goes in front of the room and he starts talking about this idea of surplus funds, that you can make money by giving money away after a foreclosure.
Yeah.
And I remember I was sitting there and I was like, how come I've never, like, this can't be real. I've never heard of this. Right. Like that was my default was like, it's not real because I didn't hear about it. Right. So I pull out my notebook that I had, and I'm like scrolling, like maybe I did read about this somewhere. And I can't find anything in this book. I'm like, this guy's a scammer. Like, he's trying to lie to these people. So I start like raising my hand. I'm like asking him questions. Like, I started like actually trying to learn, right? Like the worst reaction across the aisle. And he's answering these questions, and he's like so spot on with his answers. It's just like, I was like, God, this guy's like bugging me, It's like, keep asking questions. And then finally he's done. And I go up to David and I said, David, why would you have this guy here? Like, this surplus fund thing, this can't be real. Like, you cannot make money by giving money away. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And David looks at me, he's like, no, it is real. Like, I've done it before. And I was just like, what? Like, what do you mean? Right.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it is. Like, sure enough, the whole concept that he was teaching, which is a little bit different than, it's similar, but different to what it ended up evolving to, was he taught that day how after a foreclosure, there's this excess amount of money, and that excess amount of money is potentially owed back to the original homeowner and all that. And that if you just give that money back to people, you can collect a percentage. And what it ended up turning into was that there's just money everywhere that you can collect and give a percentage to, but we'll get to that later. But David, he was like, dude, it's real. I was like, I'll teach you how to do it and tell me how to do it. And instead of calling people that had just gone through, a death in the family and asking to buy their house, that was probably their childhood home and all these things, now I'm calling people and saying, hey, do you want some money? And it was like a way easier phone call, way less emotions. And if there were any emotions, it was positive emotions. Like, yes, I do want some money. Yeah. And it changed my outlook. I was like, wow, this is amazing.
So with that, once again, going from something you're starting to understand, being willing to step into something that you really know nothing about, right? And start at the next room at the bottom of the totem pole, but can work our way up. There's a theme here. Now, as you learn about it, like you mentioned on the real estate side, you also realize, well, there's this whole other world of other assets or, avenues that people can reclaim funds. So talk about how you got exposed to that, and then really the research that you start doing there.
Yeah. So what ended up happening was I got involved with surplus funds. There's 4 niches that we teach, and really 4 niches of surplus funds is just 4 different ways that money gets lost. And where I initially learned surplus funds was with what we call mortgage funds or mortgage overages, which is money that's, again, owed after a foreclosure, right? And for a long time, that was all I ever thought existed, was that. And then eventually, you learn about tax foreclosures, tax overages, which is basically the same thing, but with taxes, right?
Yeah.
And then I think where it really opened my eyes was I learned about something, what I call state funds. And state funds is money that is lost for any reason. It is then sent to the state government. And what I realized was that for every $1 lost with foreclosures, tax or mortgage, there's like $100 that's lost everywhere else.
Wow.
And I figured out there's like $100 billion in this money just floating around the US. And I was like, dude,
you're like, I don't need a big portion to make $100 billion, a significant dollar amount, right?
Exactly. And I was just amazed. I was like, this is crazy. And it was all like, it's all relatively, there's some differences obviously, but it's all relatively the same process. It's like, find people that owe money, connect with them, collect their money. Like, you do that tactically a little bit differently, but like, that's it. And so, long story short, after kind of realizing that opportunity and being like, dude, like, this is like amazing. And then also realizing why I didn't first know about surplus funds was because I had done a lot of my research online. Right? Being a young guy, I'm on the internet, watching YouTube videos, all this, trying to learn these different real estate investing niches, and no one was talking about it online, as far as surplus funds. So I was like, dude, if we create a company that teaches people about this opportunity of like, you can make money by giving money away and bring it online, we can educate, millions of people on this that don't even know it exists and recover billions of dollars for people.
Now my guess is making that phone call to essentially a cold call, right? Hey, calling somebody that I just happen to know you potentially are owed money or could get money. Probably not an easy phone call. Probably for many of them, in theory, it sounds like it'd be an easy phone call. Like, hey, I'm just trying to get you money. But my guess is there's probably a pretty strong guard up. Like, well, if it was that easy, why don't I have multiple people calling me, or why isn't the government call and tell me that I'm owed this money? So talk about, breaching that gap for people of, well, I didn't know I was going to be able to get it, and you're just some random dude calling me. But yeah, let's go at this together.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That's one of the most common questions we get from students and people interested in doing surplus funds. Is like, well, since your reaction was this seems too good to be true, isn't that going to be everyone's reaction? And the answer is probably yes. It is probably going to be most people's reaction.
Right.
And the way we kind of formulated and working with people and communicating with them is like, look, here's the reality. First thing is, you brought up a couple points, which is like with the government, right? Like, oh, how come the government's not calling me? Well, there's several reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is the government gets to collect the interest on this money as tax revenue. So they're actually incentivized to not give out the money, let alone even if they weren't. Like, you think government's going to devote resources to giving out money? Like,
only if you owe it. Only if you owe money.
Only if you owe money. Yeah, I've gotten phone calls saying I owe money. I've never gotten one saying I give me money. So that's number one. But beyond the point of that, like a common one we get to is like, oh, this just seems too good to be true. Like is this a scam? And with that, it's like, again, most of the time you're not getting phone calls saying you're owed 10 grand. So it does sound a little crazy. But the cool thing is like the way that we do surplus funds, like we literally have to be certified with the state. And so you can literally be like, look, I'm certified with whatever, state of California to do this. This is what I do. And we've recovered, $250 million already, doing this. So that's the biggest thing. And I'd say one of the most common other objections is like, well, why can't I just do it myself if it's this easy? Mm-hmm. And that's my favorite one, because it's like, well, I mean, you could use that for everything. I'm like, well, why don't you just represent yourself in court? Yeah. Right? Like, right. You can. There's nothing saying you can't do that, right? Obviously, you want to have a professional that's done it, right? That knows the ins and outs. Because here's the thing, with any state government, you file one thing the wrong way, you do one thing the wrong way, you think they're going to be forgiving and be like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, don't worry, we'll fix it for you. Like, no, they're not even going to tell you it's wrong. Right. Like, you do it on your own, yep. Which creates an opportunity for us to help people. So,
yes. Now, for you, just kind of thinking, hey, over the last, 5-ish years, you've had a lot of growth and development, forecasting out 5 more years, what's next on the radar, or what's Spencer looking to, what rooms he's looking to step into next?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For me, I mean, we have 5,000 students now with surplus funds. So I'd like to get that to, 25,000. And I'd like to recover collectively $10 billion. That's like one of my big visions. But above that, I love business. To me, like, business is my new sport. Like, I never stopped playing sports. I stopped playing basketball, but I didn't stop playing sports. And I think for me, like, the next frontier is getting into, software, getting into software companies and technology companies. Because, if you look at entrepreneurs and you look at different industries, right? Like, I used to think that the wealthiest entrepreneurs were the best entrepreneurs. And, because that would make sense. Yeah, like, right. If you look at income or revenue, right, or valuations as like a scoreboard, then whoever puts up the most points is the best. But what you actually realize, that's not really necessarily true. They're just in a different opportunity vehicle, right? Yeah. And that opportunity vehicle happens to be very competitive, right? Like, the smartest entrepreneurs in the world are in technology. Yep. Like, obviously, right? So I just think for me, like, that's what I'm really passionate about, is like technology, specifically like crypto and stuff like that, but just in general. And I think that's probably where I'll end up in the next 5 to 10 years, is kind of pursuing something along the lines of that. And I don't really know exactly what that looks like at this point, but yeah.
I love it. Well, Spencer, I want to say thanks for highlighting the pivotal moments. As you reflect back on your life, are there any other moments that really stand out to you that you're like, when I think back to this is really, I didn't know it at the time, but it really did end up helping shape where I am at today?
Yeah, I would say, and this, I'm going to steal this quote from a book. It's that perseverance counts far more than potential. And there's been several points in my life where perseverance has really had to come through. And I shared one of them, obviously, with basketball and all that. But another one that I didn't I haven't shared is when I first started the education side of our company. And at
Yeah.
that time, we were doing these live events. And the goal was, hey, do this live event, educate people about this, and then offer for them to come work with us. And I remember the first one we did, we had 100 people on there, we're all excited, and we, sure enough, we get through the whole thing, and 0 people decided they wanted to come and join with us, and it was like heartbreaking. I was like, oh, this sucks. Then I took a month, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna really work on this thing. I'm gonna make it awesome. And then a month later, I did the second one, and then another 100 people showed up, and 0 people said they wanted to work with us. And I did that every single week. I did a live event every single week for 16 weeks in a row without anybody saying they wanted to work with us.
Wow.
Right? And on the 17th week, we'd canceled because I got sick, and then I ended up feeling better, and so we were like, okay, let's do it. And because we'd canceled it, we only had 3 people show up, but we had finally figured out the recipe. And out of the 3 people, we closed 2 of them on working with us, and it was just like it took literally almost combining the first one with the month, or like 4 or 5 months to get to that point.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget the moment of clarity I had when that happened, which is like, given enough time, you can do anything. Right?
Yeah.
It might not be in the time frame you want, but if you give it enough time, you'll figure it out and you can make it work.
That's really good. That's really good. Yeah. And there's so much to perseverance and not losing heart when things don't go right away.
Exactly.
I love it. Well, Spencer, I want to say thanks so much for, going through your story and sharing the pivotal moments that have led to where you're at. I mean, it's cool to kind of walk through the different phases, but see a lot of the similarities as to why you became good at basketball, why you ended up getting into real estate, having success, how you've created this company and had success. But super excited to continue to watch your story and all the amazing things you'll continue to do, brother.
Absolutely. Appreciate you, Ben. It was a pleasure to be on here, and thank you so much.